The unexpected proposal. James Carter's footsteps echoed as he walked across the cracked pavement, each step feeling like a weight added to his already burdened shoulders. It was a Wednesday afternoon, but the air felt heavy, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The campus was bustling with students, some walking in groups, some alone, their chatter creating a background hum that James barely noticed. His mind was too preoccupied with the events of the day, the endless lectures that had felt like an endless blur, the stack of textbooks in his bag that felt like an anchor, and, most pressing of all, the sinking feeling in his stomach when he thought about his family. At 22, James had never expected to carry so much responsibility on his shoulders. His father's death had rocked their small family, leaving a void that no amount of work could fill. His mother, Loretta, had never been the same after that. The lively woman who used to fill their house with laughter had been replaced by someone whose health was declining every day. The medical bills kept piling up, and James, in his desperation, had thrown himself into every odd job he could find. Between working as a dishwasher at the local diner and tutoring fellow students at the university, he was constantly exhausted. But no matter how hard he worked, there never seemed to be enough to go around. As he made his way to the bus stop, James couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change. He had to find a way to fix this. But what could a struggling student with nothing but a few dollars in his pocket do to save his family? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing a message from his younger brother, Elijah. "James, Ma's not doing too well. Can you come home early today?" James felt a pang of dread in his chest as he quickly typed back a reply. "I'm on my way home now, Eli. Don't worry." He had known things were bad. Elijah, ever the optimist, tried to keep up the appearance of normalcy, but James had seen the worry in his eyes when they spoke last night. Their mother's condition had worsened over the past few months, and with the high costs of treatment, they were sinking deeper into debt. James's heart sank at the thought of what would happen if they couldn't get the money soon. The bus ride home felt longer than usual, each bump in the road jarring his thoughts. As the bus pulled up to his stop, James didn't bother waiting for the door to fully open. He was already on his feet, moving quickly toward the exit. The streetlights flickered as he walked down the familiar path to the apartment building, his worn sneakers scuffing against the pavement. His stomach growled with hunger, but it was the least of his worries. When he entered the apartment, the familiar smell of rice and canned vegetables greeted him. It was a comfort, but also a reminder of just how little they had. Elijah was sitting at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, working through a math problem. James smiled faintly, trying to push aside the fatigue that was threatening to overwhelm him. "Hey, bro, you're late again," Elijah said, glancing up with a grin. "Thought you said you were done early today?" James chuckled, though it lacked any real humor. "Got caught up with some stuff." He set down his bag and looked over at his mother, who was sitting at the stove, stirring the pot of rice with slow, deliberate movements. James noticed the tremor in her hands and the pale color of her face, a stark contrast to the woman he remembered. It hurt to see her like this. "Ma," James said softly, moving toward her. "You feeling okay?" Loretta smiled weakly, her eyes tired but warm. "I'm fine, baby. Just a little tired. You worry too much." James didn't believe her, but he didn't push. Instead, he forced a smile and joined Elijah at the table, trying to focus on the evening's meal. They had grown accustomed to the simplicity of their dinners. There was no extravagance, just the bare essentials to get them by. But the silence that hung in the air between them was thick with unspoken worry. As they ate, James couldn't help but wonder what would happen if things didn't change soon. His mother's health was deteriorating rapidly, and with every passing day, the financial burden seemed to grow heavier. He had tried everything. He worked long shifts at the diner, took on extra tutoring sessions, but it was never enough. The medical bills were piling up faster than he could earn the money to pay them, and he knew that they were at a breaking point. Elijah, sensing his brother's worry, tried to change the subject. I finished that math assignment, by the way. Easy stuff. James smiled, grateful for his brother's attempt at normalcy. That's great, Eli. You're really doing well in school. Elijah beamed, clearly proud of his accomplishment. Thanks, James. I just want to make you proud. James's heart ached at his brother's words. Elijah was still so young, and yet he was already carrying the weight of their family's future on his shoulders, just like James was. He tried to keep the tears from welling up in his eyes, but the frustration of not being able to provide for his family was too much to bear. He wanted to fix things, to make everything right, but the more he tried, the more it felt like he was sinking deeper into the quicksand of responsibility. The evening passed in quiet conversation, but James couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he was running out of time. His mother's condition was getting worse, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the night wore on, he felt a sense of hopelessness creeping in, threatening to consume him. It was a suffocating feeling, one that James had become all too familiar with over the past year. He tried to rest that night, but sleep wouldn't come. His thoughts kept spiraling, consumed by the idea of how he could save his family. It was then that his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message from Elijah, it was an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure of who it could be. Hello? James asked cautiously. The voice on the other end was calm, smooth, and surprisingly confident. Is this James Carter? Yes, who is this? James replied, his curiosity piqued. My name is Eleanor Winters, the woman said. I'm a businesswoman, and I believe I can help you. James frowned, unsure of how to respond. Help me with what? Eleanor's voice remained steady, almost reassuring. I understand the difficulties you're facing, James. I know about your mother's health and your financial struggles. And I want to offer you a solution, one that could change your life. James's heart began to race. What do you mean? I'm offering you a chance to solve all your problems, Eleanor continued. But it's an offer you'll have to consider carefully. It's unconventional, but I believe it's the best solution for you and your family. James's mind raced, trying to understand what she was getting at. I don't understand, he said, his voice shaking. What are you offering? There was a pause on the other end, and when Eleanor spoke again, her voice was deliberate, almost calculated. I'm offering you a marriage proposal, James. A marriage between you and me. James was silent, the words sinking in. A marriage proposal? From a stranger? It didn't make sense. He opened his mouth to protest, but she quickly interrupted. Before you say anything, let me explain, she said. I'm 75 years old, and I have no family left. I've built my fortune, but I find myself in need of companionship. In exchange for your commitment, I will take care of all your financial troubles, medical bills, debt, your family's future. I'll ensure that you never have to worry about money again. James's mind spun, his thoughts racing in a million directions. This was insane. It didn't make sense. And yet, there was something about her offer that felt too tempting to ignore. Eleanor's voice cut through his confusion. Think about it, James. Your mother's health. Your family's future. You can have everything you need, if you agree to this arrangement. James closed his eyes, trying to process what was happening. He had heard of crazy offers, but this? This was beyond anything he could have imagined. I need time to think, James finally said, his voice trembling. Take all the time you need, Eleanor replied, her voice soft but firm. But remember, time is running out for your family. The call ended, leaving James standing there, his heart pounding. What had just happened? What was he supposed to do with an offer like this? As he stood there in the quiet of the night, James knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change in a way he couldn't even begin to understand. A millionaire's offer. The next few days felt like a blur. James had barely slept since that strange phone call, his mind constantly racing as he tried to process the unimaginable offer from Eleanor Winters. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the words she had spoken echoing in his head, "Marry me, and I'll take care of everything." The more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. He'd always been raised with a sense of pride and self-respect. Marriage wasn't supposed to be something that could be bought. But as the days dragged on, reality began to set in. His family needed help. His mother's health was slipping further away, and the mounting medical bills were an insurmountable burden. Could he turn down a chance to save them? James tried to distract himself by throwing himself into his schoolwork, but it was nearly impossible to focus. Every lecture, every page of his textbook felt like an afterthought compared to the weight of the situation back home. He couldn't escape the knowledge that his mother's time was running out, and without significant help, there was no way they could afford the treatment she needed. The message from his younger brother, Elijah, continued to echo in his mind. "Ma's not doing well. Can you come home early today?" How many times had he received messages like that? His heart ached every time, but what could he do? All he had was his own strength and determination, and it didn't seem to be enough. By the time he got back to the apartment that evening, James had made up his mind. He was tired of feeling like he was drowning. Every day, he worked harder and harder, but it was never enough to stay above water. If this offer from Eleanor Winters could truly change things, then maybe he had to accept it, no matter how wrong it felt. That evening, as he sat down with Elijah and Loretta at the kitchen table, James felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The usual routine was in place: simple rice and canned vegetables for dinner, Loretta's slow, deliberate movements as she prepared the meal, and Elijah's attempt at normal conversation. But inside, James was a storm. He had kept the offer to himself for the past few days, but now he couldn't keep it in any longer. It was time to talk to his family. "Ma," James said, his voice heavy. "I got a call the other night. From a woman named Eleanor Winters." Loretta's face flickered with curiosity, but she didn't interrupt. Elijah, too, looked up from his homework, sensing that something important was about to be revealed. "Who is she?" Loretta asked, her voice soft, still not fully aware of where the conversation was heading. "She's a businesswoman," James said slowly. "She's offering to help us. To help with the medical bills and everything." Elijah's eyes widened. "Wait, what? Someone wants to help us?" James nodded, but it was clear this was more than just a simple act of charity. "Yeah, but there's a catch." Both Elijah and Loretta looked at him expectantly, and James took a deep breath before continuing. "She wants me to marry her." The silence that followed was thick with shock. Loretta's eyes searched his face, clearly struggling to process what he had just said. Elijah, ever the younger brother, frowned. "Marry her? Why would you do that? And who is she, exactly?" James rubbed his temples, the weight of the decision pressing down harder. "She's 75, Eli. And she's alone. She has no family. She wants me to marry her for companionship, I guess. In exchange, she'll take care of everything. The medical bills, the debts. We won't have to worry about money anymore." Loretta didn't speak right away. She stared at her hands, which were trembling slightly as she pushed her food around on her plate. James could tell she was processing the information, trying to come to terms with what he was telling her. "James." Loretta's voice was shaky, and it was clear how conflicted she felt. "This sounds crazy. Are you sure this is real? You're talking about marrying someone you don't know. And for what? Money?" James couldn't meet her eyes. His heart was heavy, but he knew there was no easy answer. I don't know, Ma. I don't know if it's real, but I do know we can't keep living like this. I can't keep watching you get worse and not being able to do anything about it. Elijah was quiet for a long time. Then, he finally spoke, his voice softer than usual. James, you're doing everything you can. You don't have to marry anyone for us to be okay. James felt a lump form in his throat at his brother's words. He knew Elijah was just a kid, but it broke his heart to see him so concerned. James had promised himself that he would protect his brother and his mother, but now it felt like he was failing them. I don't know what else to do, Eli, James said, his voice cracking. I'm at the end of my rope. I have to do something. Loretta reached across the table, placing her hand on James's. I don't want you to do anything you'll regret, James. But I also know you're doing this out of love. We've been through a lot, and I don't want you to carry this burden alone. If this is the only way to save us, then, maybe you have to do it. James's heart pounded in his chest. His mother's acceptance of this idea stung, but he understood. She was willing to put her faith in him, as she always had. And that trust, that love, weighed more on him than any amount of money could. But promise me one thing, Loretta added, her voice firm despite the weariness in her eyes. Promise me you won't lose yourself in all of this. We'll survive. You'll survive. James nodded, but the doubt still lingered in his chest. I promise, Ma. The conversation drifted after that, each of them lost in their own thoughts. James knew his family had given their reluctant blessing, but part of him still felt like he was about to make a mistake that could change his life forever. The next morning, James made the decision. He would call Eleanor Winters back. He didn't know how it would work or what would happen, but he knew he couldn't let this opportunity slip through his fingers. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was grasping at a lifeline. But with that lifeline came the heavy price of sacrificing his pride and everything he had ever believed about love and marriage. That afternoon, James dialed the number again. His hands were shaking as he waited for the line to connect. Hello, James, Eleanor's voice came through, smooth and confident, just like before. I'm ready, James said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I'll do it. I'll marry you. Eleanor's response was swift, almost eager. Good. We'll make the arrangements. I'll take care of everything, James. You'll never have to worry again. The line went dead, and as James stood there, holding his phone, a chill ran down his spine. He had made his choice. But he wasn't sure what kind of future he was walking into. For better or worse, his life was about to be irrevocably changed. The decision. As the plane descended toward its destination, the sprawling landscape of elegant estates and vast grounds appeared below, an almost surreal contrast to James's humble upbringing. His mind swirled with the weight of his decision. He was about to meet a woman who, in exchange for his marriage, promised to change everything. The thought of it still felt like a strange dream, one that he might wake from at any moment. But there was no going back now. The wheels had already been set in motion. James's stomach churned with nerves as he stepped off the plane and made his way toward the sleek black car waiting to take him to Eleanor Winters's estate. The car, with its plush leather seats and tinted windows, felt so far removed from his life, his small apartment, the worn-out sneakers, the constant struggle to make ends meet. But this was the reality now. This was the world he was about to enter, and as much as he tried to keep his head clear, he couldn't ignore the sense of unease that weighed heavily on him. The drive was long, winding through a stretch of pristine, manicured lawns and grandiose mansions that seemed to stretch for miles. The roads were empty, and James couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. There was no going back to the life he knew, no going back to the simple, everyday moments with his family that had defined his world for so long. In the distance, He could see Eleanor's mansion rising from the horizon like a fortress, its tall spires cutting into the sky. It was a stark reminder of the stark contrast between the life he had left behind and the life he was about to step into. As the car pulled up to the grand entrance, James's heart raced. He hadn't prepared for this. He hadn't prepared for the wealth, the luxury, or the overwhelming sense of unfamiliarity that came with it. The estate was nothing short of magnificent. The grounds were dotted with sculptures, fountains, and sprawling gardens that looked like they belonged in a royal palace, not something that a young man like him could ever hope to attain. The house itself was a masterpiece, towering and majestic, with wide windows that offered views of the sprawling estate. When the car finally came to a stop, a uniformed butler opened the door for James. He stepped out slowly, taking in the imposing mansion before him, the deep breath he took hardly enough to calm his nerves. He had never felt so small in his entire life. "Mr. Carter," the butler greeted him with a polite nod, "Miss Winters is expecting you. Please, follow me." James nodded, though his hands were sweating and his heart was hammering in his chest. The butler led him through the grand hall, a space that felt like a museum, high ceilings, polished marble floors, and paintings of historical figures adorning the walls. Everything in the house screamed wealth, history, and power. It was a far cry from the small, humble apartment he called home, where he had grown up surrounded by the constant hum of everyday life. This world was foreign to him. After a few long moments, they arrived at a sitting room, a vast space with velvet couches and crystal chandeliers that glittered in the light. And there, standing by the window, was Eleanor Winters. She was even more striking in person than James had imagined. Though her features were aged, her posture was regal, and there was a vitality in her eyes that defied her years. Her silver hair was swept back in an elegant updo, and she wore an expensive, tailored dress that spoke of the decades of wealth and success she had accumulated. She turned when she heard the door open, and her gaze fell on James with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. For a moment, there was a silence between them, one that felt heavy with unspoken words and the weight of the situation. Eleanor Winters wasn't just a stranger, she was a symbol of everything James had never dreamed he could have. "James," Eleanor said, her voice warm but commanding. "I'm so glad you've arrived." James stood still for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He had been rehearsing his words in his head for days, but now that he was here, the reality of the situation felt overwhelming. He nodded and took a step forward. "Thank you for having me," he said, his voice faltering slightly. Eleanor smiled, her lips curving upward in a knowing way. "I know this must be overwhelming for you," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "But you've made a difficult choice, one that will change both of our lives forever." James hesitated before sitting down across from her, his hands resting nervously in his lap. I still don't know what to think about all of this," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "It feels like too much. I never imagined I'd be here, doing this." Eleanor's gaze softened, but there was still something calculating in the way she studied him. "I understand," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "This may seem sudden, but we both know that you're doing this for a reason. You want to save your family, and I want to ensure that you can do that. My offer is genuine, James. I know it's unorthodox, but it's the solution to your problems. And in return, I will give you the stability you need. Your family will never want for anything again." James could feel the weight of her words, each one sinking deeper into his conscience. This was real. He had made the choice to marry a woman much older than him, but he wasn't just doing it for the money, he was doing it for his mother, for Elijah, for their future. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. But the doubt still lingered. Was he willing to sacrifice his own dignity for their well-being? Was he willing to trade his own sense of identity for the chance at a better life? Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. "I know this isn't a typical marriage, James. But I think you'll find that in time, it will be exactly what you need. It's not just about financial gain. It's about building something together, a partnership of sorts. James's mind was still reeling. A partnership? Was that what this was? How could he possibly build any kind of relationship with a woman he barely knew, let alone someone who was old enough to be his grandmother? But the more he thought about it, the more he understood. Eleanor wasn't asking for a traditional marriage, for love or affection. She was asking for companionship, for a sense of connection. And in return, she would give him everything he needed. I need to think about this, James said quietly, unsure of how to voice the conflicting emotions swirling inside him. Eleanor smiled, almost as if she had been expecting this response. Take all the time you need, James. But understand that this opportunity won't be here forever. Time is precious, and it waits for no one. The room fell into silence, and James could feel the tension building. Eleanor's words were both an offer and a warning. If he hesitated too long, would she change her mind? Could he afford to lose this chance? As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, a sense of urgency began to take hold. He had already made the decision, there was no backing out now. It was just a matter of accepting it, of stepping fully into this new life. Eleanor seemed to sense his internal struggle and leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. I know this is difficult, James. But I also know you're a man of principle. You wouldn't be here if you didn't believe this was the right thing to do. Don't doubt yourself now. Her words were like a balm to his frayed nerves. There was something reassuring in the way she spoke, something steady and confident that gave him the strength to push through the doubt. I'm ready, James said quietly, his voice more certain now. I'll marry you, Eleanor. Eleanor's smile deepened, and her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Good. I knew you would. This is the beginning of something important, James. I'm glad you see that. And with that, the decision was made. The world James had known was slipping away, replaced by a reality that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He had agreed to a marriage that would change everything. And as the days stretched ahead of him, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a new and unpredictable journey, one that would test everything he thought he knew about family, love, and sacrifice. But for better or worse, he was committed now. There was no turning back. The wedding. The days following James's agreement to marry Eleanor Winters were a whirlwind of preparations and formalities, each one more surreal than the last. The idea of a wedding still seemed like a distant, almost absurd concept to James. This wasn't a ceremony of love or affection, but an arrangement, one that would change his life, his family's life, and even Eleanor's life in ways he couldn't fully understand yet. But as the day drew closer, there was no avoiding it. The wedding was set, and James had to face it head-on. Eleanor had been meticulous in her planning, sparing no expense to ensure that everything went smoothly. She had made it clear from the beginning that this would be a formal, private affair. No guests, no crowds, just the two of them and a select few witnesses. Eleanor had arranged for everything to be taken care of, from the venue to the attire to the legal paperwork that would seal the deal. James had been instructed to arrive at the venue the day before the ceremony, giving him time to get accustomed to the estate and prepare for the day. The estate was even more imposing in person than it had seemed from a distance. It wasn't just a mansion, it was a sprawling, historical property that looked like something out of a storybook, complete with meticulously trimmed hedges, fountains, and sprawling gardens that seemed to go on forever. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of luxury, and James could feel the weight of it pressing down on him as he walked through the grand entrance. Everything was pristine, polished marble floors, high ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with priceless artwork. It was a world he had never imagined stepping into, and now, here he was, an unwilling participant in an arrangement that seemed stranger with every passing moment. The butler who had greeted him earlier led James down a long corridor to a quiet, intimate sitting room. Eleanor was already there, seated near a window that overlooked the estate's gardens. Her presence was still imposing, yet strangely comforting, as if she was someone who had seen it all and knew exactly how to navigate the complexities of life. She wore a simple yet elegant dress that complemented her age and stature, and her silver hair was styled into an intricate updo that added to her regal aura. "James, welcome," she said with a smile, though there was a hint of something deeper in her eyes, something that suggested she wasn't as indifferent to the situation as she appeared. "Please, make yourself comfortable." James nodded and sat down across from her, feeling a strange sense of discomfort in his chest. This was it, the moment when everything would change. His life, once filled with uncertainty and struggle, was now tied to this woman, to this mansion, to a future he hadn't planned for. Eleanor studied him quietly, her eyes sharp, as if she was reading him. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, James. I can only imagine how overwhelming this all must feel. But I want you to remember why you're here. This isn't just about a marriage. It's about securing a future for you and your family. You're doing something brave." James glanced down at his hands, unsure of how to respond. Eleanor's words were true, but they didn't make the situation any easier. His mind was still grappling with the surreal nature of it all. What kind of marriage was this? What kind of life would he have with a woman he barely knew? There was no love in this arrangement, just an understanding, a business deal that had been forged out of necessity. "Thank you for understanding," James said finally, his voice shaky despite his best efforts to remain composed. Sometimes, it feels like I'm losing control of everything. I never imagined my life would take this turn." Eleanor nodded, her expression softening. "Life doesn't always go the way we expect, James. But it's about how we respond to those unexpected turns that defines us. You've made a choice, and now, we both have to see it through. But I promise you, I won't make this difficult for you." The sound of a knock at the door interrupted the moment. The butler entered, holding a tray with tea and small pastries. He placed it on the table between them before leaving the room, his footsteps silent as he retreated down the hallway. Eleanor poured the tea with practiced ease, handing James a cup. "Would you like to discuss anything before tomorrow?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. James took a deep breath, his mind still in turmoil. "I don't know what I'm supposed to expect tomorrow. I've never been to a wedding like this. You won't have to worry about a thing," Eleanor interrupted, her tone reassuring. "This will be quick, simple, and to the point. There's no need for grand speeches or emotional vows. We're not here to pretend, James. This is a partnership, a union built on practicality, not love. But that doesn't mean we won't make the most of it. You have my word on that." James nodded slowly, taking in her words. There was something almost cold about the way Eleanor spoke, but he couldn't deny that she had a certain strength about her. She wasn't pretending to be something she wasn't. This wasn't a love story, and it never would be. But that didn't mean it couldn't work. In a strange way, James found comfort in her directness. At least he knew what to expect. The next day came faster than James anticipated. When he awoke in the guest room of Eleanor's estate, the weight of what he was about to do hit him like a wave. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of his family, the future, and the decisions that had led him to this moment. But now, there was no turning back. He had to face it. The morning was quiet as James prepared for the ceremony. A suit had been laid out for him, an expensive black tuxedo with all the trimmings. He put it on with the help of a personal assistant who had been assigned to him for the day. The assistant, a woman in her early 30s, was polite but distant, as if she had seen this kind of thing happen many times before. "You look very handsome, Mr. Carter," she said as she adjusted his tie, her voice soft but professional. "Thank you," James replied, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't shake the sense of unease in his stomach. He wasn't nervous about the ceremony itself, he was nervous about what would come after. What would his life look like when this was all over? The ceremony was held in one of the grandest rooms of the estate, a ballroom that could have been in a palace. The high ceilings, the gleaming chandeliers, the ornate decor, it was as if they had taken a piece of history and placed it in this room. There was no audience, no crowd to witness this moment. It was just Eleanor, James, and a small group of legal witnesses who would ensure the marriage was legally binding. Eleanor stood at the front, poised and dignified, wearing a simple yet elegant white dress that complemented her age. James had to admit, she looked beautiful in her own way, the light from the chandeliers casting a warm glow on her face. She was every bit the powerful businesswoman she claimed to be. But in that moment, as she waited for him to join her, James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a wedding, it was a business transaction. He walked down the aisle, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he reached the front, Eleanor smiled warmly at him, her eyes calm but intense. "Are you ready, James?" she asked softly. James nodded, though he couldn't quite summon the words to respond. The ceremony proceeded without fanfare, with the officiant guiding them through the legalities and formalities of the union. James listened to the words being spoken, but they didn't resonate with him. This wasn't about love or commitment, it was about survival, about securing a future that seemed more uncertain with each passing day. When it was finally time to say their vows, Eleanor looked at him with steady eyes. "I, Eleanor Winters, take you, James Carter, as my husband. This is a union built on trust, understanding, and mutual benefit. I promise to honor this partnership and support you, as we both seek the security and stability we need." James's voice trembled slightly as he spoke his own words. "I, James Carter, take you, Eleanor Winters, as my wife. I promise to honor this union and to support you in every way that I can." And with that, the officiant declared them married. There was no applause, no joyous celebration. It was a quiet moment, almost anticlimactic, and yet it carried with it the weight of something far more significant. James and Eleanor exchanged a look that spoke volumes without saying a word. They were now bound together, not by love, but by necessity. As the legal papers were signed and the ceremony concluded, James felt a strange sense of finality. He was married now. The world he had known was slipping further and further away, replaced by a new reality that was both daunting and full of promise. But as he looked at Eleanor, he realized that the future was uncertain. What would this new life look like? How would he navigate the complexities of this marriage, of this partnership? And, perhaps most importantly, how would he reconcile the choices he had made with the life he had left behind? For better or worse, James was now a part of this new world. And though he had no way of knowing what the future held, he knew one thing for certain: it would not be a life he could ever have predicted. The unexpected revelation. The days that followed the wedding seemed to blur together, each one melding into the next as James adjusted to his new reality. Eleanor had kept her promise. True to her word, she made sure that all of James's financial worries were wiped away. The debt, the medical bills, the mounting pressure of daily life, everything that had once seemed impossible to escape from was now taken care of. His mother, Loretta, was given the best medical care money could buy, and Elijah's education was covered for years to come. The weight of responsibility that had once consumed James seemed to dissolve with each passing day. Yet, despite the relief, something felt off. He should have been grateful, and in many ways, he was. His family's future was secure, and he had finally broken free from the constant cycle of stress and exhaustion that had defined his life for so long. But he couldn't ignore the emptiness that lingered in the background, a gnawing feeling that things weren't as simple as they seemed. What was Eleanor really asking of him? What did she want from him beyond the marriage, beyond the practicalities? Eleanor, for her part, seemed content with their arrangement. She rarely demanded anything of James beyond the occasional formal event or social gathering. Most of the time, they lived their separate lives, each going about their own business in different corners of the grand estate. James spent his days either studying or working on projects that Eleanor had assigned him, tasks that helped him stay involved in the operations of her businesses, though he never really felt like he was contributing anything of true value. It felt more like a distraction, a way to keep him occupied while the distance between them grew. Despite the distance, James found himself wondering more and more about Eleanor. He'd married her for the stability she offered, for the safety and security she could provide. But who was she really? What did she want from this marriage beyond the material benefits? Eleanor had said they wouldn't pretend to be something they weren't, and in a strange way, that honesty had been one of the reasons James had agreed to marry her in the first place. She had never promised him love or affection. But now, as time passed, James started to see cracks in the surface, the hints of something deeper, something more personal. It was one afternoon, a week after the wedding, when James found himself sitting alone in the grand sitting room, flipping through one of the many books Eleanor kept in the library. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of pages. He had spent hours on end trying to focus on the material in front of him, but his mind kept wandering back to the strange circumstances of his marriage. That was when Eleanor entered the room, a soft knock on the door announcing her presence. She looked as composed as ever, dressed in an elegant but simple outfit. There was something in her eyes, though, a flicker of something that James couldn't quite place. It was rare for her to interrupt his time alone, and the fact that she was here now seemed to suggest something important. "James," she began, her voice calm, but there was an undertone of something else. "I need to speak with you." James put the book down, glancing at her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Of course, Eleanor. What's on your mind?" Eleanor took a seat across from him, her gaze fixed on him as if she were sizing him up. For a long moment, there was a silence between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "You must be wondering why I offered you this arrangement. Why I wanted to marry you, even though you're so much younger than I am. Why, after all these years of building my life, I would choose someone like you." James swallowed, unsure of what to say. I've been wondering that. I mean, I know why we're doing this. You've explained it. But I still don't really understand why you chose me." Eleanor smiled, but there was sadness in her expression, a depth that James hadn't noticed before. "I think you deserve to understand, James. After all, you've committed your life to this union, to this arrangement. You deserve the truth." Her words hung in the air, and James could feel his heart beat faster, a growing sense of anticipation and dread building inside him. What truth was she talking about? He had already learned so much about her, her wealth, her power, her solitude, but what else could there be? "I didn't ask you to marry me just because I needed a companion," Eleanor continued, her voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "Yes, I'm alone. Yes, I wanted someone to help me pass the final years of my life. But there's more to it than that. I wasn't always this woman, James. I wasn't always the successful businesswoman with everything I could ever want. There's a history to me that I've never shared with anyone." James leaned forward, intrigued and unsettled. "What do you mean?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together in her lap. "I wasn't always wealthy. I didn't come from money. My life was nothing like this. I had nothing when I was your age, nothing but a dream, a desire to prove myself, to rise above the circumstances I was born into. And I did, James. I built an empire from nothing." She paused, as if considering how much to reveal, how much to entrust him with. "But along the way, I made mistakes. I hurt people. I pushed people away, all in the name of success. And in doing so, I lost something far more valuable than any of this wealth, my ability to truly connect with others. I've spent so much of my life chasing after power, that I neglected the one thing that really mattered. Love. And now, as I look back, I realize that I've spent so much of my life alone. James sat in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always seen Eleanor as a woman of strength, someone who had it all figured out. But now, he could see that there was much more to her story than he had ever imagined. She wasn't just a powerful businesswoman, she was a woman who had built her life on sacrifices, on choices that had cost her everything she once held dear. "Is that why you wanted me?" James asked quietly. "Because you're lonely?" Eleanor's gaze softened, and for the first time, James saw the vulnerability that had been hidden beneath the layers of her stoic exterior. "Yes," she admitted. "But it's not just that. You remind me of someone I once loved. Someone I lost a long time ago. And when I look at you, James, I see a chance to make up for everything I've lost. I don't expect love from you, not the way it's usually defined. But I need you to understand that this marriage, this union, is not just about convenience. It's not just about security. It's about me trying to redeem myself for a life I can never get back." James felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of her confession settling heavily in his chest. For the first time since meeting Eleanor, he saw her not just as a benefactor, but as a person, a woman who had lived a full life, made mistakes, and was now searching for something she could never fully recover. It wasn't about power or money. It was about the longing for connection, the desire to heal old wounds. "I don't know what to say," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never imagined. I never thought this would be why we're here. But now I see that there's more to this than just an arrangement. You've been carrying a lot, haven't you?" Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I have. And maybe, in some way, you've been carrying something, too. I know it's not easy for you, James. I know you didn't choose this life willingly. But maybe together, we can find something real. Something beyond the arrangement. Something that neither of us expected." James sat back in his chair, processing her words. It was strange, how the weight of her confession shifted everything. He had come into this marriage thinking it was all about saving his family, about security. But now, it felt like there was something more at play, something deeper. He had never asked for this connection with Eleanor, but in that moment, he began to realize that it wasn't just about practicality, it was about healing, about finding a way to move forward, not just for his family, but for themselves. "I don't know where this will go, Eleanor," James said finally, his voice steady but full of uncertainty. "But I'm willing to try. Maybe we both have something to learn from each other." Eleanor smiled, a tear escaping down her cheek. "I hope so, James. I really do." In that moment, as they sat together in the quiet room, James understood something he hadn't before. This marriage, this union, wasn't just about money or security. It was about two people, broken in their own ways, trying to find something meaningful, something real, in a world that had never promised them either. It wasn't love, not in the traditional sense. But it was a chance at redemption, a chance to build something, not out of necessity, but out of the desire to heal. And for the first time in a long while, James felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, in the most unexpected way, he had found something worth fighting for, the life-changing truth. The days that followed the heart-to-heart conversation with Eleanor felt different. For the first time, James felt as though the fog that had clouded his mind was beginning to lift. Eleanor's revelation had shifted something in him. She wasn't just a powerful, wealthy woman who had offered him an escape from the crushing weight of his family's financial struggles. She was a person, a woman with regrets, desires, and pain that mirrored his own in unexpected ways. Their marriage, which had once seemed like an exchange of convenience, now seemed more like a complicated yet necessary journey toward healing, for both of them. In the weeks that followed, James found himself adjusting to his new life. The weight of responsibility that had once plagued him, working long hours, struggling to make ends meet, had lifted. He had more time for reflection, for exploring the intricacies of his new relationship with Eleanor. But even as the weight of the financial burdens faded, new complexities emerged. Eleanor's confession had opened a door between them, one that James hadn't anticipated. He found himself questioning not just his own motives for agreeing to the marriage but also the broader implications of their arrangement. Was it enough to provide for his family? Was it enough to fulfill the duties of a husband, even if the marriage wasn't founded on love? And as he continued to spend time with Eleanor, he realized that his own heart was beginning to change. He wasn't sure if it was possible to fall in love with her, he didn't even know if that was what he wanted. But he found himself slowly coming to care for her in ways he hadn't expected. They spent more time together, eating meals at her grand dining table, sharing quiet moments in the garden, and discussing everything from the future of her businesses to the fleeting nature of time. These conversations weren't just about contracts or legal matters anymore, they were becoming something more. James found himself looking forward to their talks, enjoying the calm presence she brought into his life. Eleanor, for her part, seemed to appreciate the changes too. She had never expected this arrangement to be more than a simple partnership, but with each passing day, she seemed to soften toward James, her walls coming down little by little. But the more time they spent together, the more James began to notice the cracks in Eleanor's past. The hidden pains she had carefully buried beneath layers of success and power. He couldn't help but feel that there was still so much about her that she had yet to reveal, things that went deeper than even her first confession. It was as though she was holding on to something that had shaped her into the woman she had become, but she wasn't ready to share it all yet. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, James sat on the balcony with Eleanor. They were both sipping tea, a quiet peace settling over them as they watched the world outside. The estate seemed peaceful, almost surreal in its beauty, but James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Eleanor's story, more to this strange marriage that he hadn't yet uncovered. "Eleanor," he began, his voice gentle but probing, "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me. About your past, your regrets. But I still don't fully understand. What happened? Why are you so certain that this marriage, this partnership, is the only way forward for you?" Eleanor's eyes flickered with something. Was it fear? Sadness? Before she looked away, as if the question was one she had been avoiding for a long time. For a long moment, she didn't speak, her gaze distant, as if lost in memory she hadn't visited in years. Finally, she set her teacup down and turned toward him. "There's more to my story, James," she said quietly. "More than I've told you. It's not something I like to discuss, but I think you deserve to know. I've been carrying it for so long. It's a part of me that I've tried to bury, but it's always been there, lurking in the background." James leaned forward, his curiosity piqued, his heart pounding with anticipation. "What happened, Eleanor? What are you keeping from me?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands clasping together tightly in her lap. "When I was younger, before I built my empire, I was in love. His name was Daniel. He was my everything. I thought we had it all, a future, a life together. But I was naive, too focused on my own ambition. I was climbing the ladder of success, and Daniel, well, he wasn't. He didn't want the life I was chasing. He wanted simplicity. He wanted peace." James frowned, trying to follow her words. "So what happened?" Eleanor's voice trembled as she continued. "I pushed him away, James. I thought he was holding me back. I thought that if I kept climbing, if I kept building my life, he'd understand. But he didn't. And one day, he was gone. Just like that. I tried to find him, to apologize, but I couldn't. He disappeared from my life, and I've never forgiven myself for it. James sat in stunned silence. He had never imagined that Eleanor's story could be so full of heartache. He had always seen her as this indomitable force, a woman who had overcome everything. But now, as she spoke, he saw her as someone who had lost everything, someone who had built her empire on the ruins of a love that had slipped through her fingers. I never wanted to love anyone again after that, Eleanor continued, her voice growing quieter, more reflective. I couldn't let myself. I buried it all under layers of success, of wealth, of control. But when I saw you, James, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, someone with the same fire, the same ambition, but also someone who still had the ability to care. You reminded me of what I lost, and I suppose that's why I asked you to marry me. James felt his heart swell with empathy, his thoughts spinning in a whirlwind. He had never expected Eleanor's story to be so tragic, so filled with regret and longing. It wasn't just about companionship for her. It was about redemption, about fixing the mistakes of her past. She hadn't married him to fill a void of loneliness, as he had initially assumed. She had married him because, in some inexplicable way, he was a reflection of what she had once lost, a chance at love, a chance at peace. I didn't know, James said softly, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know you were carrying all of that. You've been through so much, Eleanor. Eleanor nodded slowly, the weight of her words hanging between them. Yes, and it's not something I can ever undo. But I wanted you to know. I didn't choose you just for your youth or your ability to help me. I chose you because I saw in you someone who could help me heal, even if I didn't admit it at first. James sat back, his mind racing. This was a revelation he hadn't anticipated, but it was one that would change everything. He had thought he was the one being saved in this marriage. He had thought he was the one whose life was being altered, whose burdens were being lifted. But now, as he listened to Eleanor, he realized that they were both in this together, bound by their own struggles, their own hidden pains. For the first time, James understood the depth of their connection. It wasn't just a contract, it was a partnership, forged out of two people's need for redemption, for healing, and perhaps even for something more. Eleanor, James said, his voice steady now, I didn't know what I was getting into when I agreed to this. But now, I think I understand. I'm not just here to help you. I'm here because we both need something. We both have our pasts, our mistakes. And maybe, together, we can find a way to move forward. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also with something else, something deeper, something unspoken. Maybe we can, she said softly. And in that moment, as the evening sky darkened and the world outside grew quiet, James realized that this marriage wasn't just about surviving. It was about learning to live again, learning to heal, and perhaps, in time, learning to love. If not in the traditional sense, then in a way that was unique to their shared journey. As they sat together, the weight of their past slowly lifting, James felt a sense of hope for the future, one that he had never thought possible. Life had brought them together in an unexpected way, but maybe, just maybe, it was leading them towards something neither of them had imagined.